Okay. Okay, everyone, it seems that we are ready to roll. Welcome to Environment Link Scotland's election hustings for this year's Holyrood Scottish Parliament elections. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm Joyce McMillan, I'm a journalist, I'm a writer, but I'm also the president of Link for the next 2-3 years, and very much enjoying becoming more involved in the debate about Scotland's environment because after all, as almost everyone in this room knows, the environment is not just one issue among many. It's the issue that underpins all the other issues. Our care for the environment affects every aspect of human well-being, of our possible futures, of the energy we use, of the way we use and own our land, of our health, of the way we handle new forms of urban regeneration, of energy policy. Every single aspect of the important political debates that the Scottish Parliament will be facing in the next 5 years after the new Parliament is elected is founded on questions about our environment and how we treat it. So we're gathered here, I think, to look at some of the most fundamental underlying issues which any parliament actually in the world is now facing, and which certainly the Scottish Parliament, with the range of powers that it now has, will be facing in the years between 2016 and 2021. Link, as you all know, is the umbrella organisation for major environmental groups in Scotland. Not every major environmental group is a member, but a very wide range of groups are, ranging from groups protecting specific species to groups with particularly rural countryside or agricultural concerns, to people concerned with diet in our cities, and with developing a new food culture for Scotland, which certainly appears from its health statistics to need one, to groups interested primarily in energy, in marine conservation, and every single kind of environmental concern that you can think of is represented within this network. So it's a very, very interesting experience for me to be the new chair of it, but I think it also provides a platform for a very, very interesting and wide-ranging discussion tonight. First of all, we'll be hearing short introductory remarks from all of our speakers. Then we'll have a bit of banter and debate amongst ourselves, and I'll pick the speakers up on any kind of obvious questions which seem to me to follow from their introductory remarks, and then we'll open to the floor, and certainly I'm expecting with this audience that there will be plenty of questions from the floor and plenty of debate, and we hope to finish about 8 o'clock, at least for the formal part of the evening. I'm sure there'll be some discussion after that informally. Now, the parties represented here tonight are the 5 parties that were represented in the Scottish Parliament elected in 2011, and we're delighted to have a very distinguished, a very varied team of panellists here tonight to represent those parties. So on my far right here, not in politics, but in physical position, at least as I'm looking at the room, is, well, I hope not in politics, Martin. No, you never know with the Lib Dem, but anyway. Martin Veart is the Liberal Democrats' MSP candidate for Edinburgh North and Leith in the constituency poll. Martin's a consultant with ICOE Research, the International Centre for Oil and the Environment, which is a not-for-profit organisation which promotes the development and application of environment, health and safety practice in offshore oil and gas operations. So he's coming at the oil industry from a health and safety and environmental angle, and he believes that renewables are the key to Scotland's energy future, and that reducing global greenhouse emissions is a key part of the planet's future. So that's Martin Veart, who's here representing the Liberal Democrats. Next to Martin, you'll see Mark Ruskell of the Scottish Green Party. Mark is a councillor in Stirling and a former Green member of the Scottish Parliament. And when he was an MSP, he was deputy convener of the Parliament's Environment and Rural Affairs Committee. He introduced legislative proposals on climate targets and on liability for GM crops, and he successfully protected the Fife coastline from oil transfers, and he's also worked in the renewables industry himself. Next to Martin, representing the SNP, currently in government, is Heather Anderson. Heather is on the South of Scotland list for the Scottish National Party, and she's an elected member of the SNP National Council. She's an organic farmer living and working just south of Pennycook, and she's also a campaigner for social justice and a rural businesswoman. She would provide good views on food waste and developing a better food system, says the information I've got here, and that's certainly one of her primary interests. Welcome, Heather. To my left, and probably needing little introduction to this group, is Sarah Boyack of Scottish Labour. Sarah's currently an MSP for the Lothian region. She's she's Labour's environmental justice spokesperson. She chairs cross-party groups on international development and energy efficiency and renewables. She's a former Environment Minister at Holyrood and a long-standing MSP, and she is a candidate, Labour's constituency candidate for Edinburgh Central. Welcome, Sarah. And finally, on my far left, most inappropriately, is Miles Briggs, who represents the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. A phrase which is perhaps more current now than it was 10 years ago. Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. He has worked recently as an advisor to the Scottish Conservative MSP Liz Smith, and I must say I've always noticed the quality of Liz's questions at First Minister's questions, so presumably Miles was responsible for the research behind some of those. He's a graduate of Robert Gordon University. His degree was in Arts, Politics and Management. His hobbies include hill walking, rugby and Scottish history, and he is a candidate for the Edinburgh Southern constituency. So please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, our first request of our panel is that they give us a short introduction to their views. I think they were told very strictly that they could only have 2 minutes. Perhaps I'll be very kind and let them have maybe 3 or even 3 and a bit, but I certainly don't want them to go on much longer than that. And what we're hoping is that they will respond to this document. I don't know if it exists in a slightly jazzier form now, does it, Jen? This is Jen of Environment Link. But anyway, this is Environment Link's 6 steps towards a sustainable Scotland, which we're using as a basis for discussion in this election campaign, which is about putting sustainable development at the heart of public policy, achieving a sustainable economy, using sound science responsibly, promoting good governance, ensuring a strong, healthy and just society, and living within environmental limits. Those are the 6 headline points of the 6 steps towards a sustainable Scotland. So we're hoping that in their opening comments, all 5 candidates will reflect on those. Miles, do you mind if I start with you?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Joyce. Well, thank you very much for including me tonight. I've worked with a number of you in the Parliament over the past 5 years, and I think actually one of the successes of the Scottish Parliament actually has been the fact that all our charities, all our government organisations are actually in that Parliament on a daily basis working and actually influencing policy. And I think actually Scotland's had quite a successful time over the last 17 years in the Scottish Parliament with actually people being able to influence policy. And looking at the heading today of how do we actually deliver a more sustainable Scotland, I was looking at lots of briefing documents which were sent at the election time and thought I would come along and I could say all these different things, but actually it came down to one thing I feel, and that's actually how we change human behaviour in Scotland, because that's going to actually impact on how we actually safeguard our environment and how we actually improve it. So at this election we're putting forward a number of ideas, building on some of the policies we've helped influence in the Scottish Parliament. The first one, which you may have noticed already, is actually the fact that we want to see more national parks. There's 3,500 national parks across the world. Scotland only has 2 of those. So we want to see the next Parliament look at the whole of the country and actually speak to communities to see whether or not we can put in place more national parks. Beyond that, I want to see more put into actually how we do more recycling across both business and in our communities. One of the things which is raised with me as a candidate constantly is actually recycling is quite difficult, especially here in Edinburgh. So I want to see a harmonisation of recycling across Scotland, so that wherever you are, your blue box, you know what to put in it and where it's going to be recycled. Because I don't think there's a lot of confidence actually when I'm recycling. I don't have a huge confidence that actually when I take glass along to the recycling station that it's actually going to be recycled. And so it's something which we need to see, give our consumers, give our our whole citizens the confidence to actually carry on and do more recycling and encouraging it. We've made a big policy announcement today of an extra £1 billion we want to see the next Scottish Government spend on actually making our homes warm and actually, above all, to reduce carbon emissions from homes. It's a statistic which always hits me that 90% of British homes are actually using gas to both cook and heat their homes. And until we start to address that, we're not going to reduce carbon emissions from our homes. Cars are a big issue as well, and I think that's actually where the European Parliament and Westminster really needs to get their act together, and the Scottish Parliament can play an important role in that as well. Because at the moment in Scotland, there are only 1,100 electric cars out of 3.2 million, which is, just shocking. And actually looking at statistics online, I noticed today that the recharging sockets which we've seen rolled out across Scotland, most of them have only been used once in a month. So there's lots of policy interventions we can put in place in the next Parliament to make a huge difference to how we do live our lives. One of the policy areas which I've been particularly interested in the last Parliament was wildlife crime. And actually the merging of all the police forces in Scotland into one has actually seen that go off the radar. Grampian had a really good, successful record with wildlife crime because they had a specific wildlife crime officer. I want to see that actually given more emphasis in the next Parliament because we need to actually see direction from government to address these issues. I'm probably running out of time. The final part you mentioned in your email to us, Joyce, was actually how will we work together was the question. And I actually think that the Parliament's got a good reputation of all the parties working together in this field. I want to actually see more cross-party work in the next Parliament. The issue really which struck me was actually if we end up with President Donald Trump, we're going to all have to work together. So thank you very much for your time and I look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Miles. Thanks. Right, I'm just going to come along the table in this direction. So Sarah, do you mind going next?
Yeah, definitely. Well, delighted to be here and also delighted to see so many environmental hustings with different groups over the next 2 to 3 weeks. I think it's important that everybody actually gets in and mixes in with what we want the next Scottish Parliament to look like. When I was coming here tonight, I was thinking, and what have we done in the first 4 Scottish Parliaments? Well, the first Scottish Parliament set up 2 national parks. I never thought that would be the end of the story. I think it's time for Coastal Marine National Park and maybe more on land. We also set up the first biodiversity strategy. We had the first land reform bill. We kicked off with big renewables targets that were described by the civil service as radical and brave, which we all know what that means. But we have more than surpassed them. We've doubled what I set in the early days of the Parliament. The second Parliament, we had action on the National Planning Framework, big rail investment, action on flooding, new policies on flooding, action on procurement in terms of food. The third Parliament, big legislation in terms of Marine Act and the Climate Change Act, delivered by an SNP government but with a minority SNP government, with all of you in the room and the rest of us on this platform having the capacity to shape that legislation and get some really radical amendments through. And this fourth term, the last one we've had, I think it's been a bit of a reality check because there are lots of good things happening, good expansion of onshore renewables, but not enough in so many areas, and particularly for me, biodiversity targets and climate change targets. We're not doing nearly enough on either of them. And I think the idea that it's not sustainable development but sustainable economic growth, we need to centre things back to sustainable development so that it's intergenerational, so that it's our social policy, our environmental policy and our economic policy, and that they link in together. And for delivering on climate change, that is the key thing we need to do. It's not any one of those aspects. And if we're going to tackle the inequalities in our society, we have to be thinking about linking health and transport and housing policy. We have to be joining up the dots. We have to be concerned about generations of young people not able to read or write when they leave schools. So there's a whole investment in our schooling we need. We need to think about how we expand what eco-schools have done over the last few years. And for me, this is going to be a Parliament that's either going to be implementing austerity or is going to have the space to do something different and something radical and using the new powers we've got. So that's what my party's overall concept in tackling social justice and environmental justice problems, we think we should have fairer taxes. If you're on £150,000, you should pay 50p in the pound. If you're on above £20,000, we'd like you to pay a penny more. And that's crucial for the environment, because we need to make sure that environmental policies are not squeezed as they've been in the last budget. So your asks on sustainable development at the heart of public policy, yes, but translating it into real action. Achieving a sustainable economy, driving with renewables, the circular economy, investing in green jobs that we need for the future, green engineering, making sure that our further and higher education institutions have got the numbers of young people going in there that could be the skills for the future. If we want to build 60,000 affordable houses, we need young people who are trained up to actually build those houses. So we need the skills agenda to be a green skills, a transition agenda. And on the Climate Change Act, we need to have our report and policies and programmes, not a little apology every year because we haven't gone far enough. It needs really to drive change. It needs to properly link into the budget, and it needs to drive into everything the Scottish Government does, so that environmental impact assessment and policies applies right across, not to most things. And then the ideas on science and good governance. Climate policy has got to drive the next term of the Scottish Parliament. The defining issue for the next Scottish Parliament is, will the world have begun to tackle climate change? We have led in terms of the ideas, we haven't always led in terms of implementation. And to me, that's the big strategic opportunity for the next Scottish Parliament. That's about good governance, not just at the Scottish level, but partnership between the Scottish and local level. And that means local government being empowered, having the funding, having the resources to do so many of the things that we need on the ground in our parks, in transforming the planning system we have, to deliver a sustainable environment and to deliver a sustainable economy and to deliver a sustainable culture. And the last point I'd make, the biodiversity and climate targets, they have to be crucial. I don't think the emphasis has been on biodiversity in the last Parliament. I think that needs to change for the next. So in terms of marine policy, national parks, landscape, and species issues, they've all got to come together. So let's make the next Scottish Parliament as exciting as the first four, but let's make this a Parliament that actually delivers on sustainable development, delivers not just for the next 5 years, but the next 10, 15, 20 years. That's got to be our ambition. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great, and we'll move on to Heather for the SNP. Heather?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Heather Anderson. I'm the candidate for the South of Scotland. I'm also an organic farmer and a campaigner for some more sustainable food and farming systems. The first sentence of the SNP constitution is to protect the environment of Scotland, so your agenda is also our agenda. We think the next 5 years are going to be about consolidating all the progress so far, but widening the focus of activity so that we're looking at farming, we're looking at schools, education, the right to an education sustainabilities, food waste in cafes, better insulation in homes, more sustainable transport. We need to increase the targets where necessary, and we have to keep working even harder to make Scotland the best in the world. We are going to be increasing renewable energy production, decreasing carbon emissions and building more sustainable food and farming. And we'll work with anybody in any party to make that happen. Climate change is above party politics. And I think there's a track record on working together over the last four parliaments. The UN Climate Change Secretary said that our progress so far was exemplary. We want 42% emissions cut by 2020, and we're 3/4 of the way there. Christina from the UN Climate Change Secretary, who I'm obviously on first name terms with, said that our aim of producing 50% of our energy from renewables was impressive. Well, last year we did 57.5% of our energy production from renewables. We're still aiming to get to 100% of demand by 2020, and we've exported 38% of our renewable production. We've been investing in supporting tidal energy projects. The largest one in Europe is in the Pentland Firth, and we're on target to meet our heat renewables with a target of 11% by 2020. So all the targets are there, and they will be increased if need be. There is no lack of passion and no lack of commitment and no lack of seriousness about it. We also need to look at the other things. We've done very well on the technical stuff around renewables and reduction, but we need to move to behaviour change, so the whole thing around improving energy efficiency in homes, putting money into the district heating loan fund, supporting people to understand why recycling and reducing food waste is critical. These are all behavioural change programmes that we need to engage in. We have supported renewable energy, community renewable energy projects. In fact, we've busted our target of 500 megawatts 5 years early, so we're going to have to increase that target. We've taken action on marine protected areas, and I certainly think there's more to do there. Richard Lockhead, the Cabinet Secretary, negotiated a no discharge ban in Europe, so we'll see how that develops over the next period. And most importantly for me, it's bringing together these different agendas. So in our Cabinet Secretary post, we've brought together food, farming and the environment. The next bit to add into that mix is health and well-being. So we now have an organic action plan. There's real seriousness about the role that sustainable agroecological farming can contribute to reducing carbon emissions. 15% of all emissions come from before the farm gate, and we know that farming organically can reduce that by 23%. So looking at farming and working with farmers is a critical next stage. And the NFUS for Scotland have actually said that they completely recognise the importance of farming and crofting, especially high-value farming, in delivering an environmental outcomes. So we do live in very interesting and exciting times. So I think for me it's about producing our food more sustainably, engaging our communities in these issues, reducing food waste. Cabinet Secretary just announced world-leading targets of 37%, and increasing food citizenship and opening Scotland's larder to everybody in Scotland.
Thank you very much, Heather. And next to Heather, for the Scottish Green Party, Mark Ruskell. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks very much, and it's great to see so many people out here today. A lot of familiar faces. I know we haven't worked together in the last couple of years, but I'm very much looking forward to the opportunity of getting back into the Scottish Parliament and renewing a lot of the relationships we had working on policy in the Scottish Parliament on a range of different areas. And I think the last couple of years it's been a really exciting time in Scottish politics. You know, we've obviously had the debate on the referendum, and I think that's ignited a debate around the kind of vision of the Scotland that we want to create. And I think particularly on the back of the Paris climate change talks as well in December, you know, we're starting to get a sense that another world is possible, that we can move beyond the world that we're living in at the moment and move into that low carbon future that we so desperately need. But I think to do that, we do need a bolder and a greener Holyrood. And I think we've got that opportunity because there are new powers that are coming to the Scottish Parliament. The Greens won through the Smith Commission new powers on fracking licensing, so we can ensure that the gas that we can't afford to burn stays in the ground in Scotland. We've got new powers also coming on energy efficiency, which I think is very important, that we can try and tackle the obscenity really of fuel poverty in our society in the 21st century. And I hope that you'd recognise that the Green Party at Holyrood over the last 16 years has got a strong record, not just on these two issues, but on other issues as well. We're the first party to introduce the proposal for climate change laws. We introduced a proposal way back in the first session on sustainable farming, and we introduced the concept of a Zero Waste Scotland as well into Scottish Parliament as well. So we tend to sort of trailblaze, we tend to get the ideas into that Parliament and then drive progress. But, you know, one of the powers that I'm really excited about in the next session is the power to actually tax fairly as well. Now, the Greens want to use tax progressively. We want to lower taxation for those people earning less than $26,000, put tax up a little bit more for people earning more than that, and then ramp up tax for those earning over $150,000. But there's an environmental link here as well, because if we can reduce inequality, if we can make our society more socially sustainable, we can also raise the tax revenue to then reinvest back in our economy and to reinvest back in the environment as well. So, you know, I think infrastructure is a really important issue in terms of how we get that sustainable economy. You know, we need to be investing in infrastructure that's part of the solution to climate change rather than part of the problem. And that does mean looking at rail reopenings. It means looking at how we invest in our homes to reduce carbon emissions, but also to tackle fuel poverty. Now, I think, we're the only party standing in this election that is really taking the transition that's needed away from oil and gas to renewables seriously. And that's why we've set a target and we're developing a plan to create 200,000 new jobs in renewable energy and other low-carbon sectors by 2035. We need an industrial strategy that can actually drive that, and we need to ensure that our college places, our skills training and our infrastructure investment is behind that target. I'll talk a little bit later on about food farming and health. We want to introduce a Food Farming and Health Act so that we can eat more of what we produce in Scotland and produce more of what we eat. The public pound and the role of the public sector in terms of procurement is really important here. We want to establish a right to food into legislation so we can abolish food poverty as well. And yes, we're going to continue on that bold agenda for land reform as well. The Scottish Parliament made a start in the last session, but we think we can go further. We can go further by protecting some of the green spaces that exist around our towns and our cities. We can increase biodiversity through that as well, get more community ownership, more opportunities for community-supported agriculture and community management. So I think, with a greener, bolder Holyrood in the next session, we can move mountains. We can really start to progress this agenda, and I very much look forward, if I get in 5th of May, working with you all. Thanks.
Thank you. And finally, Martin, for the Liberal Democrats. Martin.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending. The Liberal Democrats at our recent conference in Edinburgh passed a motion that says that we are going to put the environment and climate change at the centre of our policies. There was a further debate on that, which I'll be happy to come back to during the course of this. Yeah, I guess a few of you might know what I'm referring to. I took a full and active part in that, so I'll be happy to answer your questions there. Sorry to sound a little bit discordant from the rest of it. I agree with a lot that's been said so far across the board here. But for the Conservatives to ask for another £1 billion spending for our homes, that's wonderful. But one has to ask, why do they so slash the environmental and the green budget at Westminster? And absolutely threw into reverse what was happening there. Through the Liberal Democrats in the last coalition, we were able to build up and sustain the momentum on green energy and green investment. Now we are seeing countries across the United Kingdom who should be booming at this time, going into reverse, laying off 10,000 jobs in one case. And it's a poor situation. Unfortunately, the SNP has also, days after returning from Paris, managed to cut 40 million off the renewable budgets here in Scotland. This is really not a good situation for going into if we are serious about replacing our oil and gas-based economy with a renewable sector. Liberal Democrats, for us, it literally begins at home. We would work with any party to make sure that our houses in Scotland are suitably insulated. I've lived in Norway and I can do a direct comparison to the standard of housing that we have here. And unfortunately, I've got direct experience on living in some of the Edwardian flats here in Edinburgh when I first moved to the city. It was cold. It was genuinely cold, and we need to work to get that standards increased across Scotland. Also, I would like to see on top of the warm homes, we've got 40% of people in fuel poverty. That will start to address that, and in areas of in rural areas, can be up to 60%. We need to have more houses across Scotland. We're pledging 40,000 social houses on top of the affordable houses, which we'll mention in our manifesto coming out on Friday. But there has to be so much more movement on communal heating and renewable heating sources. It was mentioned that we're on target to reach our 11%. At the moment, the number stands here in 2016 at 3%. We've got to get our skates on this. It is by 2030, it is 40% the target. So if we're serious about this, we've got to act now. And I will support any party that does take this issue seriously. And also on the marine protection area, we're living in an interesting time on that. I want to be led by the evidence. You've got to take stakeholders' opinions into account, especially the fishing industry. But we're going to see larger-scale decommissioning over the next 10 to 15 years in the North Sea as far as oil and gas are concerned. And that is just a world market factor. There's very little we can do about it here in Scotland. It can raise interesting opportunities for marine protection areas, incorporating some of that existing infrastructure as artificial reefs. Now, I would like to listen to more informed opinion on that, but we have got great opportunities here in Scotland to make sure that we are the seed areas, if you like, for a sustainable ocean and for the future of fishing and the environment here in Scotland.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you all. Well, plenty of food for discussion there. Can I just raise, before we go any further, the question of future energy policy, because obviously everyone here has talked kindly of renewables. Obviously Scotland is making substantial progress on the proportion of our energy that is generated from renewables, and we've received some international compliments on our ambitious targets in that respect. But we do still face debate in two areas which are very, very important, which are not only important in themselves for energy policy, but which tend to reveal underlying attitudes to how seriously people are taking the carbon transition. And that is the debate about the future of our oil industry, given the recent collapse in the oil price, and the debate about fracking. So I'd just like to quickly whisk around the panel and take the views of all the parties on those before we open out to some of the other issues. What's your position, Len?
Well, we've been quite clear that we want to see a mixed energy basket in Scotland, and what we've been working on is actually how do we achieve this low carbon economy which we're all supporting. And we believe that there is quite clearly a role for all energies in Scotland, and that's where we start from. In terms of planning, I don't know if you want us to touch on things like fracking. We've said quite clearly that local councils and local government have the responsibility to decide, and that's where I think if we're going to actually be giving local government the power which they want, then they have to be able to listen to their communities and take that decisions forward that way.
Yeah, so that makes it quite difficult then to have a national policy on carbon reduction, because if you've got local governments going hell for leather, perhaps under pressure to create jobs in the immediate future for fracking developments in their local areas, and you've got a government which is saying, no, we're trying to reduce our carbon emissions, how does that work?
Well, at the end of the day, it's whether or not local councils want to take these decisions. I think they will then be responsible to their local electorate if they decide to do that. But the direction we've said quite clearly is a lower carbon economy and having that mix, because at the moment I think a lot of parties are rolling out areas which can help secure a lower carbon economy, and that's actually, if we're going to achieve that, where we all have to actually have a long-term vision of that.
Yeah. Okay. Sarah, what's the Labour position on fracking and on the future of the oil industry, which is of course causing huge concern in the northeast of Scotland at the moment?
Well, we need to be in a transition phase because we need to be reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, and we'd be very keen to make best use of the North Sea oil and gas we have at the moment, and that's why the UK's abandonment of carbon capture and storage is such a huge setback. That's something that it would have been good for the UK to pioneer as a technology that could be used by other countries to reduce their carbon emissions as well. And in fact, I was reading an article today that said the low price of oil and gas is actually making it harder to push for more effective use of that oil and gas and more energy efficient use of that oil and gas. Because the top thing we should be doing is conserving our use of energy. Before we think about producing new energy, we should use what we have much more effectively. So the next generation of battery technology should be part of the transformation in Scotland. You can see that in the communities that are beginning to experiment with it, particularly in the islands. I think the UK government's not just cancelled carbon capture and storage, but the decision on solar and small-scale community renewables has been very, very It's a very backward step. We only just made the threshold in Edinburgh with the Edinburgh Solar Project, and I would like to see community co-ops. We've got a lot in the rural communities, particularly in the Highland and Isles. I'd like to see them in our urban communities. I'd like to see municipal energy. I'd like to see renewable heat. You know, most of our cities are built on rivers because of the trade that developed centuries ago. And if you look at the technology there, if we had a Warm Homes Act, we could start rolling out community heat projects and have much more locally generated heat. It's not just enough to think about the lights going out. We've got to think about heating in Scotland as well and link that into fuel poverty. And that's why if we're tackling carbon emissions, we just don't see a place for fracking in Scotland. We pushed really hard for a moratorium, and then when we got the moratorium, you look at the science behind that and the research that's been done, and it's all basically to give it a green light after the election. So I think we need to push really hard in this. We should not be opening up a new front of new carbon emission energy in Scotland. And I've got, as an ex-planner, I have got real reservations about the whole of the Central Belt. It's where our old mining communities are, it's where our old mining works are. And I just think in terms of the environment, the issue of methane leakage, the issue of impact on communities, it's just too risky. Never mind the carbon emissions. So for us, it's a no ifs, no buts, no fracking position.
No fracking. Okay. Heather, difficult for the SNP on two fronts in that there's known divisions within the party on fracking, and there's also the close association between the modern SNP and the oil industry. You know, because the SNP founded a lot of its early success in the second half of the 20th century on the idea of Scotland's oil and the prosperity it might bring. So what's the position now?
I think in terms of it, Scotland's oil, I don't think anybody could have foreseen Saudi Arabia and Iran plummeting the oil price, so I don't think we can be entirely blamed for that situation. I think there's a strong recognition in the party that there are a huge number of jobs in the North Sea, and there has to be a planned transition. There are a phenomenal level of skills in all of those jobs that can be converted to skills in the renewable industries. In terms of fracking, there's very strong opinions within the SNP membership about fracking. We've got 2 moratoriums on at the moment, so in terms of straightforward fracking, there is no fracking. It will not be carried out unless there are absolutely no unanswered questions or doubts. So basically the moratorium that applied has an evidence gathering phase which will run until the end of summer this year. And then there'll be a consultation, because part of the issue for the party is we have to govern the country. So although it would be nice for us individually to ban fracking, we have to take into account all of the scientific evidence, all of the data that we can to make a completely robust case about the action that we take. So it's evidence gathering, it's scientific based, it's a long period of making sure that everybody is consulted and has their say so that we make the best decision. In terms of underground coal gasification, we've also put a moratorium on that. We don't have devolved powers in that respect. That's still reserved to Westminster, but we've basically asked the gentleman who was the ex-head of SEPA to carry out an investigation and consultation into underground gas gasification, coal gasification. So both are under moratorium. None is happening, none is planned. We're making sure that we get all the evidence we need to make the proper decision.
Okay, thanks, Heather. Mark, presumably the Greens have no truck with the oil. In fact, the Greens have been accused of heartlessness in relation to the oil industry and of being pleased that it's going into crisis. Is that a fair?
Well, no, I think it's about transition,
yeah.
And I think it's about ensuring that we listen to the workers within those industries as well. I think if you look at the targets, you look at our Green Jobs Plan, there's the potential for 100,000 jobs in offshore wind by 2035, but there's also jobs in decommissioning. We've got over 400 structures sitting in the North Sea that need to be decommissioned. Some of them are actually heavier than the Empire State Building. I've got 10,000 miles of gas pipeline as well to decommission. So there's jobs there, and there's potentially intellectual property as well that we can export to other countries as we start to move through this, the end of the fossil fuel age, and we start to move into other technologies. I think in terms of fracking, I'm frustrated with this because, the evidence has been there for some time. I sat there in the public inquiry along with Friends of the Earth, 2 years ago, and we had the evidence coming from Australia to ban fracking then. We had the evidence presented at that public inquiry into the Earth CBM application between Stirling and Falkirk. So I think, the evidence is there, and the Greens have been putting motions down in the Scottish Parliament for some time, inviting other parties to sign up. We put down a motion in 2014. All the parties on this panel rejected that. They rejected the argument for a ban. And I think what we've got at the moment, although a moratorium on some of the technologies is welcome, effectively it's only a pause. The fracking industry themselves are really, because of the low oil price, they're looking for a window to invest in maybe 2-3 years' time. So it's really uncertain at the moment what we're actually going to get if we get a new SNP government. But I think the evidence is there now and has been presented in the past to actually ban fracking in Scotland. I think in terms of an wider energy strategy, Sarah's mentioned many elements of that. And I think, this idea of your municipal democratically controlled energy, the kind of sort of energy vendor that we've had in Germany, and where we go to, European countries and cities like Helsinki, all of these places have got their own, municipally controlled district heating schemes. Energy is much more democratized, and I think there's a real opportunity for us in Scotland. But we do need to have a supportive Westminster government as well. And, I'm a councillor in Stirling, and we had a proposal for a 5-megawatt solar farm. It would have brought millions into a council at a time when we're facing huge amounts of austerity. But of course, we just missed the deadline for the collapse in the rock subsidy payment that was pulled by the Westminster government. So we need to see subsidy and support, but we need to have an energy system that is much more democratised. We need to think about other aspects like energy storage as well as efficiency.
And given the existing powers, would it be possible for the Scottish Parliament to step in there where Westminster, obviously there would be an argument about the actual money, but there's no shortage of powers, is there, at Holyrood now to step in areas like that and run Scottish-based schemes to support like the Stirling scheme you're talking about? I think there are some interesting funds, actually, give credit to the SNP government, there are some interesting funds that have been set up. One is around local energy systems. So I think you're starting to see more community groups now that are looking at how they can match demand and supply and are actually creating energy systems on a local level. And that's the kind of initiative that we'd like to see supported, because there are constraints around grid. And I think if we're going to create local energy systems, then we need to match up supply and demand. So, there are ways to support it, but the big subsidy cuts have cost jobs. I've got friends who've lost jobs in the renewable sector, and, it's affected us. It's affected us seriously.
Can I just say there, last month, three projects in Shetland, Clydebank and Glasgow were awarded 1.75 million to develop water source heat pump technology. So we are beginning to do that. So that investment in localised heating. There was also a pledge in the previous manifesto from the SNP for My Power, which was about, local energy being provided through housing associations and councils. So again, saying, can we buy energy more cheaply and provide it more cheaply and recorporatise?
So these ideas are beginning to keep in, Sarah?
I was going to say the Warm Homes Act is structurally how we could start to deliver this. If we were to deliver 60,000 new housing, affordable houses over the next 5 years, that would be the trigger for investment.
And these would be greenhouses?
All the new housing we're building now is much more energy efficient. I think every new housing should have some form of renewables attached to it, whatever's most appropriate. Solar, I just think, should be now standard if it's in the right area, and we should be designing our homes to benefit from the natural environment. But there's such a range of renewables technologies that we just need to do this. But I think at the national level, the work needs to be done between the Scottish Government and local authorities, because they are cash strapped at the moment. And I was up at Harlow Hydro today, and it took them years to get going. And it's a pretty small scheme. So we need to make sure that the planning departments are energised to actually go out and do this, and that they've got the skills that they can take from the Scottish Government. So I think more of a partnership type approach. And basically, the new heat systems that are being developed, we're exporting them to other parts of the world. We've got really good companies in Scotland. So I would just like to see more of that. And I think the Scottish Government should be thinking about the new energy powers it's got and thinking more creatively. I mean, there's a number of things the Parliament started off doing that we didn't initially have the powers to do in terms of supporting investment in all sorts of areas. So I think an investment bank in Scotland that would focus on investment in Scotland. There's lots of ideas we're thinking about as to how you generate the jobs to the green economy, and marine is the bit of the renewables industry that's not really taken off yet. So maybe a little bit more time to go with that.
I should be coming to Martin. Sorry, Martin. I just thought I'd
I thought I fell off
two
the edge of the
fill in the
table
gaps there, because it was a bit of a debate about the relationship between local government and central government, and indeed Westminster. So the Lib Dems on these two hot topics in
absolutely.
energy.
No, of course that it was our policy while we was part of the Westminster government to see renewables coming in on every scale, from the smallest scale on a private household right through to community level and district level and so on up. Unfortunately, with the cut in subsidies, especially in the Westminster, it has to be said, that has really put back the private individual's ability to pay the subsidies on electricity tariffs, for example, which has enjoyed have been really greatly slashed, and the problem. Let's be absolutely clear what we're talking about here. By 2030, we're talking about an electricity-based economy. Oil will no longer feature very much in the equation at all. The plan for our transport, and oil is going to be for minimum for transport and chemical feedstock. That's about it. So we're looking at long-term low oil prices. If you like, it's back to where we were in the early 1970s before OPEC cut off the supply to the West and engendered the first oil crisis. And the technology that we're looking at is all going to be based on electricity. Now, as far as Scotland is concerned, we are facing real issues here, because every single party here wants to see renewable energy. But will that demand be able to be kept up as the gas supply that we are taking from the North Sea is going down? I will tell you, from the late 1990s, which was peak for both oil and gas, we are now below 70% of that production. Well, we're down to about 30% of what we used to produce in the 1990s. Okay, and that's only going to fall. When it comes to the sustainability of the North Sea oil and gas factor, I was in a meeting the other week, and they said, let's forget about, how much we are making, how much it costs to maintain everything, and let's look at the actual bottom line after you take all the taxes and everything into equation. It looks like that the oil companies are losing $9 a barrel on every barrel they produce out of the North Sea at this time. That simply cannot go on. And then when it comes to maintenance, we already had the Bray Alpha in 2014 had a major gas release down to poor maintenance. So that impetus to keep that piece of metal going is going to lead to shutdown sooner rather than later. This is why, and I'll get on to the Lib Dems and fracking now, there was that motion in the Lib Dems, because we looked at the energy reports, part of which was commissioned here in Scotland by the SNP government, and it's the Independent Expert Scientific Panel report on unconventional oil and gas. Now let's take this by fuel. Coal is obviously the most dirtiest fuel in terms of CO2 emission. That has to go. I think we can all agree on that. Gas qualification, underneath the fourth, I've got my reservations on, because they claim that's still 20% cleaner than burning solid coal. However, that still makes it far dirtier than anything in oil and gas production. Oil doesn't even feature now in electricity generation across the UK. It's just simply not there anymore. So we have got two sources to fill the gap between renewables being able to take up everything, and that is gas and that is nuclear. Now, the SNP government, and actually I'm no great fan of nuclear either, they say no more nuclear. Fine, okay. We know what the Conservatives want to do. They're really investing heavily in Hinkley C. That's going a bit pear-shaped. I feel sorry for EDF, frankly. You know, may they survive.
Unfortunate.
Yeah, may they survive their good fortune in winning the contract. You know, but it is absolutely it's just financially not working there. So we're left with gas. The gas production offshore is going to continue to plummet. So this is why the Liberal Democrats, during our conference, we looked at the evidence partly on this report. And the second question was, how does it compare in greenhouse gases emissions globally? Is it more greenhouse gases by importing it from via tanker or via pipeline? Or is it going to be less greenhouse gases if we produce it here? Now, and it seems that there is another report commissioned by the Business Environment, and the Energy, BERR, in Westminster, that suggests it compares very favourably with imported sources of oil and gas. We have the personnel here because we have a lot of expertise has been readily established, and we have the safety inspectorate. The one thing that the Conservatives did very well was acknowledge there was a lack of expertise in this country, and that's why they got in the Norwegians to as an independent monitor of land-based oil and gas exploration as to monitor the safety issues here. It would have been no more than a bridging technology. That was our argument, because if we go purely for renewables, we risk falling short and having to import our electricity from other areas, from sources like Iceland, which has not even been, which is just in the discussion at the moment. We need to get a move on, otherwise the lights will start to dim. So that is why it was voted, and then it was reversed by the leadership who said, no, we're not going to campaign on this. So at the moment, the official Liberal Democrat policy is to ban fracking. It's something that I have had interesting email conversations with Willie Rennie. However, but we both agree that the main purpose is to reduce overall global greenhouse gas emissions.
Right. Okay, so the Liberal Democrat position is to ban fracking at the moment, but there's a substantial body of opinion within the Lib Dems which sees fracking as a much cleaner option than any of the other transitional options.
Absolutely, than importing our gas from either from places like Qatar or from the US.
Okay, well,
or we could become an independent country and subsidise renewables.
We could, indeed,
yeah.
we absolutely could.
How the SNP starts.
Well, I think there's a general positive about renewables here. It's just how we get to that point of having a completely renewable energy economy. Okay, well, we have an audience that is absolutely throbbing with potential questions here. I can see people twitching. So let's hope a few of them want to start. I can see one there. I'm just going to make a note of people who want to raise questions. So one there, and another 3 here. Okay, that would be more than enough for our first round. We go here first. Thank you very much. If you want to say who you are and what organisation you represent, then fine, but you don't have to.
Sorry, Robin Parker from WWF Scotland. It was very noticeable that in the opening remarks, lots of, I think everyone on the panel talked about the energy efficiency of our homes, and that's really welcome because, as I think was pointed out, it's half of our climate change emissions. And I think all the parties also on the platform also support making energy efficiency a national infrastructure project, which is also really important, really welcome, because we need to take a long-term approach to this. But my question was going to be about, yesterday the Scottish Greens put their cards on the table in terms of setting a target for this energy efficiency project, saying we should reach a C by 2025. We should reach a C energy performance standard for all homes in Scotland by 2025. Yeah. Today, the Scottish Conservatives said we should get all homes to a C by the end of the next decade. So I want to ask, what do the other parties? Will the parties meet that challenge? Will they match that challenge? Will they go beyond it? Perhaps, because I think having that kind of target's really crucial. You wouldn't go around building a a road and not knowing how far your road is going to go or how far your bridge is going to stretch.
Yeah.
So we need that overall objective.
Yeah, okay.
All the other parts.
Targets for home energy efficiency. I'm just going to take a few questions and then we'll come back to the panel. This gentleman here is next.
My name is Nick Cox. Sorry. Thanks. I'm in the Green Party, Friends of the Earth, various other organisations. I'd like to take up the point about fracking possibly reducing global greenhouse emissions. I think that's a load of cobblers, frankly. It increases the global total of fossil fuels available. We saw this in the United States. The claim has been that the United States cut its greenhouse emissions because it's switched from coal to fracked gas. What's happened is that all the coal is exported. It's used elsewhere. The more fossil fuels you produce, the lower the price, the more is used. That's very simple. And the science is absolutely clear. We have to leave 2/3 of the currently recoverable fossil fuels in the ground if we're to avoid catastrophic climate change. It's very simple.
Thank you. Okay, I'm sure we'll have yet more debate on that. Andy Miles, formerly Links Parliamentary Officer. Andy?
Andy Miles, not representing anybody.
For once.
I've got a very specific question, and it's about wildlife crime. And I'm very glad that Miles Briggs raised the subject, because all the parties over the years have made comments on wildlife crime. But something that I've been arguing and Link's been arguing is that the Partnership Against Wildlife Crime in Scotland spends a very large amount of its time, if not the majority of it, dealing with poaching. And I don't believe that poaching is a wildlife crime. I think that with poaching, the animal's going to end up dead one way or the other. It just depends whether it's the poacher or the estate that's going to do the killing. So it's not a wildlife crime issue, it's an issue about property rights. And I'd like to ask specifically, would your party, or would you as a candidate in the next Parliament, be prepared to take on the issue of separating out poaching and wildlife crime?
Thanks, Andy. Right, now I've forgotten who the people in the middle were. Yep, lady here with the long hair. Thanks. There's another microphone.
Sorry, I was looking the other way for the microphone. Yeah, my question's around the Scotland's land use strategy. So I'm interested in each party's thoughts on where the land use strategy should sit in terms of political priorities. So interested in where it might sit in relation to economic strategy, in relation to agricultural and forestry strategies, and also in relation to the land reform agenda. So how do we position land use strategy compared to the ongoing land reform agenda? And I'd also like to ask, at the current moment, I believe the land use strategy has no budget attached to it, so will it have a budget going forward?
Okay, thank you. That's 4 huge questions, so I'm going to come back to the panel at the moment, but I'm bearing in mind that there were more people over here and in the middle with their hands up, so we'll come back to you after we've had this round from the panel. Now, if you all answer each of these questions, it'll take forever, so if you feel that someone else on the panel has more or less covered the territory, please feel free not to say anything about one of these topics. For instance, on energy targets, we've heard that the Greens have already this is for energy targets for home efficiency, and the Greens have already declared a target, so in a sense we don't need to hear from Mark. But the challenge was to the other 4 parties to say what their target would be on home efficiency. Miles, you're looking keen.
Well, I think we were mentioned as well. Today we had announced our policy, and actually it's quite a good week to be talking about this, given the fact that we've seen such a scandal in how we've built buildings here in Edinburgh, especially our schools. And I think actually we need to really open up this in the next Parliament, because the quality of our buildings, I think, is getting worse and worse. I spoke to a lady yesterday who was talking about the buildings they shut, and they were old Victorian schools in many cases, but they were saying there was a big push to have them refurbished, and the council told them that couldn't take place. They had to have these new schools. And you're looking at the life of these schools being about 40 years. And I don't think that's good enough. And it's going to be a huge issue, I think, whether or not this next Parliament takes action to improve homes. Because there's a lot of people across Scotland living in fuel poverty, but actually it's the state of their homes and the insulation which we need to really address. So we said today we want to press the next government to have that £1 billion over the course of the Parliament, which might not actually solve all problems, but it's the travelling, as you said, which we need to start. And it's an area I think all parties, if we commit to, can in 5 years' time, see huge progress.
And have you named a target date as the Green Party have?
We've said at the end of the decade. To be able to,
end of next decade or this decade?
This decade.
What
to be able to have, we've laid out this Parliament the next 5 years we want to see 30% of homes addressed.
30% of homes, okay.
Also our affordable housing strategy, which was mentioned, we want to see 100,000 extra homes built. 50% of those would be affordable and up to these standards as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah, has the Labour Party named a strategy for green homes?
I can be really coy here because we haven't announced our manifesto yet. It's coming soon. But I think it's absolutely clear that the challenges with existing homes, our new homes are much more energy efficient. The challenge is how you link up the existing homes you've got, how we make them energy efficient. But we also need to keep an eye on people's incomes, because although fuel costs are a key issue, the issue of poverty is something that needs to be tackled as well. So in terms of people's incomes, the living wage and the new welfare policies we'll get in the Scottish Parliament, they need to be factored into that process. And when you talk with people like Energy Action Scotland, they're absolutely committed to much higher standards in the buildings, but there are also human aspects to this that I think we need to tackle and do it in a more joined up way. And some of their ideas about linking in with a health service so that people get proper referrals and they get proper advice so that they know they get the income they're entitled to. I think it's got to be a joint strategy, so it's both about the people and about the houses. In terms of 2050, by the time we get to 2050, we're basically going to have weaned ourselves off carbon. And the carbon we use in 2050 is going to have to be incredibly important, and you have to be able to justify it. So it's the whole economy is going to have shifted. Farming, transport, housing, energy, business, all of us aspects of our life. So it's got to be about the transition. Andy's question about poaching, I will think about that. I've certainly got colleagues in rural Scotland who would definitely have a view on that. That's quite a strong view because they're quite in touch with local communities. And I think it takes us to the question about land reform, about communities being able to benefit from the land, whether it's food production, how we look after our animals. And I think for me one of the exciting things about the next term is how do we have communities and co-ops engaging in land reform, and there's a whole raft of things in the partnership.
Indeed, Sarah. I'll come back to the land reform and land use issues, including wildlife crime, in a minute. But if we could just finish the round on energy efficient homes, because certainly living in Scotland all my life, I don't think I've ever seen a really energy efficient home in Scotland, or at least only once or twice. Heather, sorry, I've got the right name there. Heather, what's the SNP's position on that?
Well, our manifesto is not launched either, and I'm not privy, but I can probably guarantee there'll be a bidding war in terms of targets. What we do know is that we have achieved carbon emissions through reductions in emissions and production through renewables. We know that renewables are under threat because of the UK government policy. So we're going to have to focus on everything else as well. So home energy efficiency will be up there as a key thing. 1 in 3 people in Scotland have benefited from the Energy Savings Fund interest-free loans, and we'll continue to focus on how to make that a more efficient programme. I just wanted to say, in terms of land use strategy, are we allowed to answer that one yet?
No. Okay. Honestly, I will let you come back to that, because it's such a big topic. I want to give it a round of its own. Martin, what about the Liberal Democrat view on home energy efficiency?
Well, home energy efficiency, as I said in my opening remarks, is one of our central platforms in order. It ties into the social justice of having people in fuel poverty as well. We want to see that cut back as much as possible. I welcome the targets that the other panellists have put out. I don't know if they're frankly achievable. I mean, the SNP put out a target to end fuel poverty by November 2016. Yeah, exactly. I'm sorry, but that's not going to be met. And so I think that we have a consensus here that we should work as hard as we possibly can towards addressing that situation. May I come back on the fracking? that at this time, 30% of our electricity comes from coal. We need to end that as soon as possible, and I think we can both agree to leave the coal in the ground. But that's going to leave a big hole as to where the other electricity comes from at this time. So the Liberal Democrats, we want to see the end of open cast coal mining in Scotland. And
certainly be good.
It is close. Okay, well, we're out of date on that one then, guys. But we certainly have, if that's coal production has to end, and globally it has to stop imports across the UK.
Yeah.
That still leaves us with an issue.
Yeah, I think we've already had quite a good round on that,
Okay,
and we can understand the position.
Okay, so just a quick one on the poaching.
No, we're just coming to that now. So we're coming now to the land use strategy question, and there was a specific aspect to that, which was: is there going to be a budget for this, or is it just going to be sort of general sort of urging and nudging, or whatever it is government now does when it hasn't got enough money to actually do anything? And that does include, in a way, certainly questions of land ownership, include Andy's question about wildlife wildlife crime, which of course is carried out not only by poachers in inverted commas, but sometimes certainly in relation to protected species by people who are not poachers at all. So let's begin with Mark on that. What's your position?
It's an interesting,
on land use ownership?
I think actually quite an interesting interrelated set of issues to unpack there, and I'm quite intrigued by Andy's question about this relationship with poaching and wildlife crime. I think there's a wider issue there about the management of country estates. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of criticism of estates that are practicing driven, grouse shooting. And we know what those environmental impacts are. The muir burn, the raptor persecution, the use of veterinary medicine spread over moorlands, the targeting of non-target species like hares as well. And I think, I think we need to see a reform of country estates and the way that they manage themselves. I think that if that can't take place, then the argument in favour of licensing will kick in. And you've obviously seen, high-profile calls and petitions for a banning of driven grouse shooting as well. I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of the evidence, but I think there needs to be a willingness from the larger landowning interests to address the very serious environmental problems that they're creating. And I think, personally, that probably leads to some form of licensing going forward. I think then in terms of the wider land use strategy, I mean, for us as Greens, this is absolutely critical. The land is where we stand on the planet. And, of course, you'll all know the figures about peatlands being the equivalent of Scotland's rainforests in terms of the carbon sequestration and everything else, as well as being vitally important habitats in their own right. I think there's an opportunity here, not just with the land reform agenda, but also with the future look at the CAT reform agenda as well, to say that land should be serving the public interest. It should be serving the public good. And if there are land managers, be them farmers or estate owners or communities or whatever, that are meeting the public good, that are actually delivering public benefits, be it flooding attenuation or habitat restoration or species reintroduction, then there's an argument for those landowners to be getting public subsidy. I think where there's clearly environmental degradation taking place, then that's where the concern kicks in. But I think there's some exciting opportunities coming up. I think with, in particular with repowering of wind farm sites, and there's an opportunity to look at a whole landscape scale approach as well. How can we actually design our landscapes to be integrated better between forestry and renewables and habitat recreation and everything else. So, it's a very important area, but I think in terms of funding, the use of public subsidy, I think, is going to be critical here in how we direct that into delivering public goods rather than just, putting money into a system for food production or shooting things or something else.
Yeah. Is there anyone who's got a question before I come to the rest of the panel on this? Yeah, a guy up here, just behind you, Jen. Yeah.
Bruce Wilson from the Scottish Wildlife Trust. It relates directly to Anne's question, and it's due to the rural hustings that I attended last week, which was organised by Scottish Land and Estates and NFUS. Now, there's broad consensus among the parties represented that there was a desire to cut red tape and get rid of hurdles for farmers. how is that to be achieved and still deliver this public benefit that's just been talked about? Are we giving false promises to the rural sector that we're going to be getting rid of these hurdles, whilst also expecting a real return for our public money?
Thanks very much. I'm just going to let Mark briefly respond to that, and then I'll come to the rest of the
panel.
panel.
Yeah, I think we did have
a
a debate there about the complexity of some of the subsidy arrangements, and I think we were talking in particular about agri-environment schemes. I mean, I think what I would want to see is perhaps an end to discretionary sort of payments. So, if there is public good that's being delivered through subsidy, then we need to make sure that that application process and that monitoring process is proportionate, and that it enables farmers and landowners to engage with that, to do the right work on the ground for that to be monitored and to get the subsidy payment. So I think from my perspective, the red tape might be in some of the administrative issues, and obviously the big issue at the rural hustings was the failure of the SNP government to procure a decent IT system, which means that farmers are just sitting there, they're expecting subsidy payments and are getting absolutely nothing. So that was the element which I think was really concerning people, and I think the consensus in the room was about creating proportionate regulation and ensuring that farmers and landowners aren't wrapped up in red tape. They know what they need to do to get the subsidy, they get on and start delivering it.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Heather, I'll let you answer the question about the alleged IT fiasco. Well, I think it has been an IT fiasco.
There has been an IT fiasco.
Yes, but about the IT fiasco. But I'm going to come to Miles now, because Miles, you speak for the landowners, and the Tories always have. And the name of Robert Mugabe is frequently thrown around when anyone talks about the land being basically a matter of the public good rather than of private prerogative. So where are the Scottish Conservatives on this? And will you put some clear bluish water, or pinkish water maybe, between yourselves and the traditional attitude of the UK Conservative Party, which I must say been unashamedly on the side of landowners historically?
Thank you for that easy, non-biased.
We might as well cut to the chase. I mean, this is the case. So
to go back to your land use point, I think actually not to just single out this government, but actually over the last 20 years, we've seen more through actually the European Parliament's direction on this, a movement towards incentivising managers actually and landowners as well to actually protect our environment. And I've visited some estates, some single farmers with small pieces of land actually who are doing a fantastic job. And actually it's that carrot and stick approach which I think's worked well in some areas, but if we're talking about kind of the budget, I'm not specifically sure how much if there will be a budget and what level there will be for the land use. But I think we need to actually look at the wider situation, not just looking at estates and farms. We need to look at our communities, because in Edinburgh Southern, for anyone who lives in that constituency, we've got 2 pieces of land which are under threat. One has actually is being developed at Craig House, which was a piece of community land which now people don't feel welcome to go in. We have another one, Midmar Paddock, which is a great piece of land used by so many people to walk, take their children to play, which the council are looking to develop. So it's actually the land ownership rights as well, I think communities want to look at being discussed. And it's not just the awful landowner often, it's brownfield sites. We're talking about building all these new homes, but where are we going to build them? What pieces of greenbelt will be developed? And that's where communities and people really get angry, because they don't feel ownership of it. I was told the other day that actually down at Leith, the land which was never developed beside Asda there, no one knows who actually owns it, and it's likely to be an offshore trust. Now, we need to find this out and actually look at how we're going to develop Scotland properly.
Excellent, Miles. So the Conservatives going to... Are the Scottish Conservatives going to go in hard on people's right to know who owns the land? Because that's quite radical.
I think we should look at it.
I mean, it's more radical for people in Edinburgh, they I think want to know.
We'll work with you on that.
Isn't there a fantastic picture of the famous Andy Whiteman standing in the middle of that patch of land with a thing saying nobody knows who owns this?
It's just a shame shame you didn't back the Green amendments when it came up in the land
Yes,
reform bill. Otherwise, we would have had banning
We could have had the
the ownership of offshore ownership of land.
Were
and
we
we'd have
going to come back to the wildlife crime
Yes, of
issue?
course, no, on you go, you
Because
can
I just
talk about
wanted to,
wildlife crime
because I'm not sure, kind of, Andy, in terms of things like fresh water mussels, how that would work. But but in terms of a poacher sort of situation, I thought at the minute poachers were under the legislation.
They're under the Partnership Against Wildlife Crime. But what I'm telling you is that it's not environmental crime. The animals are going to die anyway.
Yeah.
So it's not environmental
it's a
crime.
yeah.
It's a crime against property rights.
Yeah.
We're wasting a lot of time dealing with poaching, where there are a tiny number of offences, while environmental crime, wildlife crime, is actually being ignored.
Yeah.
And I want that changed.
So are you suggesting that it's the landowners and their agents who are the main perpetrators
I think
of...
poaching should go back to being just a normal
Yes.
crime like any other.
Yes, but what? How are you? Who do you think are the real criminals then, Andy?
Sorry?
Just say what you think. Who do you think are the real criminals in this? Who's killing the hares? Who's refusing
I think a lot
to?
of the wildlife crime,
Yeah.
it's got vast amount of it, is being actually perpetrated by the very people who say that they're against the poachers. And that is a real mess, right at the heart of Scottish Government policy, and one of the reasons why we've made so very, very little progress on defending our internationally famed wildlife.
Okay, so landowners, farmers and their agents are attacking supposedly protected wildlife for short-term economic gain. Is that the gist of it? I think it is. Miles, how would you respond to that?
Well, I think in terms of poaching, a lot of crime and wildlife crime specifically, I think could actually be part of a larger picture of crimes with people who are actually taking place. So I think I kind of support you half there. I certainly know I spoke to a gentleman who runs a dogs charity up in Angus, and he was saying actually all the sort of animal welfare issues he has, the police don't investigate and aren't interested because there's so many other crimes which they're pursuing. So I'm not quite sure how we build that, but I think the single police force has been such an issue where I don't think actually it's wildlife crime has been part of the discussions. It's been Grampian. We actually went out with the wildlife crime officer, and he went to all the shows. He knew people, and this is maybe going back to your point. He kind of knew the individuals he wanted to take a real interest in, and the estates specifically as well. But that's all gone, and I think actually I hope the next Scottish Government will look at reforming Police Scotland and actually reforming how we prioritise things within Police Scotland. I think wildlife crime has to be put back on that agenda because it's been lost since it was merged.
And is that in your manifesto, the reform of Police Scotland?
Yes. So we've said we want it to be accountable to the people it's serving. We've not set a figure. Obviously, we went from 8 to 1. We've not set a figure, but we want to see more local accountability because people that actually don't feel Police Scotland are accountable to their communities any longer. So we want to address that and actually for specific issues like wildlife crime to be put back on the agenda as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Heather,
Some facts.
Yes, a lot to go with.
The SNP government have increased the fines for wildlife crime to £40,000 and increased the imprisonment to 12 months for serious offences, and they're also looking at the use of impact statements to deter people. So yeah, it's a very serious issue. We continue to look at it. We've made sporting estates pay rates, which hasn't been very popular, but basically said it's a level playing field. Everybody has to pay rates, you'll have to pay them too. We're promoting land reform rather vigorously, rather passionately within the party itself, and we're using the Community Empowerment Act to encourage local communities to get involved in looking at common land and use for common land. For me, the use of land is completely integral to the Land Reform Act. We've had a 250-year displacement from our land and what it is used for, and until we get people reconnected with that agenda, we won't be banging at the doors asking for that land to be taken into common use. So that's a real campaign to become engaged in. You talked about subsidies from Europe. We're at a critical point in farming. 90% of the farms in Scotland could go bust without subsidy. And in June we have a referendum for European membership, which could mean we leave Europe, and Pillar 1 payments, which go directly to farmers to support the cost of production, probably would not be possible under World Trade Organisation rules. So we're in a very, very critical point. We've been taken to a dangerous situation. I spend a lot of my time arguing about cap payments, who gets them and what they're used for, and in respect to the EU referendum, I'm fighting to keep them. I would rather reform them than lose them. And everybody knows that in farming the direction of travel is towards public benefit, public good, more money for greening, and you have to actually do something to earn that level of public support, and that was stated at the Hustings quite clearly. So I think farmers know that's coming, whether or not they're in denial about it, but they know that you can't get that level of public support without doing public good, and it's completely tied into sustainable land use.
What about the IT fiasco?
Oh, yeah, well, part of that was the National Farmers Union of Scotland was very insistent that, unlike England and Wales, where there's one rate of payment for land, they wanted 3 rates of payment for land. They were told at the time that that would ensure that the payments were delayed. So because every single field in Scotland had to be reassessed and fitted into one of 3 categories where it had never previously been assessed like that. I think that the Cabinet Secretary is not the first person in the world to be let down by an IT system. And what the Scottish Government did at that point was create an interest-free loan and have been working flat out to get the majority of these payments out. The actual deadline for payments is June. Farmers are just used to getting payments in December. And as somebody who campaigned for independence, we did spend a lot of time saying if we didn't vote for independence, we might be taken out of Europe and subsidies might cease. So we'll have more to complain about after June if we're taken out of Europe than just a delay in the payment regime.
Yeah, yeah, but it has been quite traumatic.
And a lot of farmers are starting to now get paperwork to say, this is you looking at your land use and looking at putting in for different schemes, and they have zero confidence in the actual system. So I think actually to blame it on the NFU isn't completely the true picture.
I didn't blame it on the NFU. I said the NFU made the transition much more complicated than it had been.
Yeah, I was about to come in to agree with Heather on a couple of points till she started talking about the IT system, which was completely badly designed from the scratch. I've met some of the people that were involved in the design of it, and from day one everybody knew it was not working and it was way behind schedule. And the fact that rural businesses have expected the money
sorry, just say that again. Everybody who was working on creating it knew that it was not working and was behind schedule.
Yeah.
They were flagging up concerns from the very start.
It was flagged up last March, over a year ago. And the system proceeded. Yeah, we've had several debates in Parliament. It's been raised at the committee on a regular basis. So I just want to park that I wouldn't, however many disagreements I might have with bits of the farming community, I wouldn't blame them for the complete failure of the IT system. I think in terms of the issue of the land use strategy, which was one of the issues which was raised earlier, it was one of the things we wanted in the Climate Change Act because we felt there was a gap. The issue of climate emissions and land use in Scotland is something that hadn't been dealt with sufficiently, and it needs to link in with the land reform agenda, it needs to link in with the national planning framework, and it needs to link in with the reporting policies and programmes. And for me, the land use strategy feels just like a work in progress. It's not there yet. Everybody I've spoken to who's read the different revisions of it, that it's not really delivering what our ambitions were when we asked for it to be in the Climate Change Act. So I think it's unfinished business for the next Scottish Parliament. And I think it does link into what's happening in terms of cap reform. And I think this is one of the agendas where Scottish Environment Link can actually make a big influence in the next Scottish Parliament. Because I think we need to start talking about cap reform at the start of the next Scottish Parliament, not kind of putting it off till we're at the buffers on it. And the points I was going to agree with both Mark and Heather about agroecology, more organic farming, having a more integrated approach to things like forestry, flood management and land management generally. This is the opportunity to try and tie them together. And the other thing that I would add to the process is it's not just about rural Scotland. I passionately believe that in terms of land management and food growing And particularly in terms of the social justice agenda, we've got to think about urban Scotland as well as a potential place for growing food and for getting people involved in managing their own environment. And I think there's some really exciting ideas that some of you have been floating in your manifestos. And it does help if you know who owns the land, which is why we supported the amendment in the Parliament and in the committee, while we argued that we thought that there needs to be much more transparency on land ownership. And the big shift in the Land Reform Act, which we support, is that is both urban and rural Scotland potentially have a community right to buy, and that is transformative. So I think we need to be thinking, those of us in the environmental movement, about how we make that make a difference. And it's partly about local authorities, and my Labour local authority colleagues are beginning to think about this as well. There are some difficult decisions buried in there. You look at Edinburgh selling off plots of land everywhere. So taking the pressure off local government finance is important, but there are exciting ideas about how we get more community allotments, community gardens. And when I think about land reform, I now think about that as part of our agenda, because so many people in urban Scotland are detached from that whole food production and that growing movement. And that would be one of the things I would like us to see in terms of environmental justice change in the next term of the Parliament.
Yeah, that's it. This is great. I'm loving all this common ground now. You're dreaming about the urban space.
Can I get in, please?
It's Martin's turn, really. Can I come to him? Martin?
Thank you.
Martin, talk to us about land use strategy.
Well, sorry about my little bit of frustration, but I was seeing it going back and forth. So, yeah, the Liberal Democrats, we do support an effective land register. I live in Leith, on the edge of that no man's land where nobody seems to know who owns it. And
those lawyers do.
Well, hopefully some lawyers do. Not only has there got to be an effective land register, there has to be transparency and perhaps even limits on how much one legal body or a individual can own and be registered land to. Also, have a look at the non-EU ownership of land. That is an idea that we are certainly taking seriously to stop, because, through shell companies, it can be anything and can be owned anywhere. So its centre point is to have an effective land registry in order to get to the bottom of who owns what in this country. And then we can start to look on. Now, you mentioned the farm subsidies and land use. Now, this is a very interesting question because of climate change. Just as something that Sarah was going on to, because we're looking at managing the river systems on a basin-wide level. Now this and part of that is going to be reforestation, which is going to change land use across the whole water basin for any particular river system. Now that is in order to reduce the effects of flooding. Where I used to live in Petercuta, just outside Aberdeen, for example, that was one of the houses that got recently flooded out just this year. That was not subject to flooding prior to that before. We're facing more extreme weather and more violent storms and flash floods, and we can learn lessons on how to manage this from other parts of Europe, such as might not seem a logical leap, but Portugal, for example, the coast down there has been subject to floods and violent summer storms. So we have to take lessons from our European colleagues on how to manage this. And I'm not sure how that's going to tie into farming subsidy and reducing red tape for farmers, but thank you for raising that. When it comes to our environment as a whole, I believe that because of prior practices in forestry, for example, planting of the monocultures of trees that have just recently been harvested across Scotland. There were schemes in the 60s, 70s and into the 80s of planting these vast monoculture forests. They basically became treeland deserts almost. A very bad
Sitka slums.
Yeah, very poor for ecological diversity. And also, to get on to Andy's point, finally, yes, I I don't know what our official policy is via poaching, via other parts of wildlife crime, but I do know that the Liberal Democrats have said that we want to be far harder on crimes against especially predator species like raptors. And I would make the observation that we are out of kilter completely when it comes to, say, deer population, for example. The occasional cull doesn't really do it. And we need to, with the cooperation of local communities, look at the possibility of reintroducing some apex predators back into the Scottish wildlife scene. Because a cull only happens for a month or a week somewhere, and then the deer come back in. But if they smell a wolf, then they know to stay away from that area for months.
Yep.
So, you know, it is a complicated scene, and we will use evidence bases in order to reach some long-term answers.
No, there's a wonderful debate to be had about the entire rewilding of Scotland and the apex predator species, as you say, that could be reintroduced, but I don't think we have time to have it now. I'm just going to take 2 or 3 more questions from the audience, and then we'll start our wind-up phrase. Oh my goodness. Immediately, 8 people put up their hands. That's absolutely dreadful. Okay, I'm going to ruthlessly favour women, because we've only had one question from a woman so far, who was the one who raised the question about land use strategy. So, lady at the back there, first of all. Yeah, the one with the stripy sweater. Yeah. Could the rest of you that want to ask questions in this session put your hands up again? Yep, Helen. Right, okay. I'll try and get round you all, but I might have to miss a couple. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Maggie Keegan. I work for Scottish Wildlife Trust. I want to bring the debate back to connecting people to nature. That is a key manifesto ask for ourselves. In fact, I did actually send out manifesto ask around all of the people who are speaking tonight, but probably didn't have a chance to look at it. There's been a lot of talk on building houses, new houses that we're going to need. We would say that we want to build places, not houses. And part of building places is having good, high-quality green infrastructure. So what we want to know is what does your party plan to do to improve the access of local communities to biodiverse green space? Thank you.
Thanks very much, that's lovely. Helen Todd, this is the chair of Environment Link.
Thank you. Yeah.
Helen Todd of the Ramblers Association.
Ramblers Scotland, yeah. Up to now, no Scottish government has spent more than 2% of its transport budget on walking and cycling, and yet surely it's a no-brainer in terms of climate change, obesity, air pollution, you name it, that we should.
I'll jump in there.
What's going on? Has she delegated her question to you?
Thank you very much. Claire Simons, Planning Democracy. With the government's current emphasis on sustainable economic growth, how do the panel think that the planning system can be improved to protect the environment better? And just as a wee hint, I did notice in it, and also some of the people have mentioned about behaviour change. I'm just wondering whether there's anything about developers and some of their less desirable tactics, perhaps.
What? Changing the behaviour of developers? Oh yes. Anti-social. Well, it should serve as goes on them, I suppose. Right. Okay. I'm going to take 3 more, and that's absolutely it. Lady at the back there with the scarf. Yeah.
Hello, Laura Copley from Earth for Life. So someone mentioned about behaviour change, and if behaviour change is going to be part of the solution. My question was about education. So one of the biggest problems, I think, is that environment and sustainability is still an add-on satellite subject. And this is both in our cultural language, is also in wider policy areas, as seen by the funding cuts. So the question is really, will there be future reform to the education system to support integrating the concept of sustainability and it being this add-on subject? So that includes triple bottom line, circular economy, outdoor education. That's the kind of things that need to be integrated. So is that on the agenda at all?
Mainstreaming environmental education, yeah, wonderful. Here, yeah, gentleman here. Here's your microphone coming.
How do we change the house building culture so that we, force spec house builders to build more joined up houses in the interests of environmental and social sustainability?
I don't know. How do we change our building culture so we have stand-up schools? Here, yeah, lady in the lovely motto.
There's lots of questions to build it up here, so I don't know, you might not get to my... Max Hall, I'm a food sovereignty activist, Common Good Food, and a few other organisations. I was just wanting to hear about the party's broader policy on food, because it's not just all about farming and cat policy. Heather in particular, you're really well known in the sustainable food sector, and I'm sure all of us really admire your leadership and ambition that you've shown so far up until now. I personally worry a lot that your party's ambition doesn't quite meet yours. Up until now, the SNP policy on food has really focused around food as an economic driver, looking at food for export, and very little action or change for the likes of urban communities, as was mentioned just previously. We're seeing countries like France and Denmark really lead the way in Europe in terms of using agroecology and organics as the benchmark for our policy in Scotland. We've also seen the EU today pass new laws on the use of Monsanto's Roundup, which is hugely welcomed but isn't necessarily in law. So there's lots of really ambitious things happening there, but up until now the SNP really hasn't led on this. So I'd like to hear from Heather, but from everyone in particular, about what are your specific food policies that are going to make the changes that we need to see.
Excellent. Right, I think there's one more, this lady here, and that is going to be absolutely it.
Keep a note of that.
Well, you can't all answer them, so we'll make sure each of them gets at least one answer from somebody. And that one was very clearly directed at you about the food culture, Heather. So.
Hi, Sarah Dolman from Whale and Dolphin Conservation. So predictably I'm going to ask you a marine question. We're seeing declines in some of our seabird populations and our populations of harbour seals. And it looks like the west coast population of killer whales will probably go extinct in our lifetime. So I'm interested of killer whales, west coast Scotland population of killer whales, because of chemical pollution and other factors. So I'm interested to know what the parties plan to do to turn these declines around and make our marine environment the healthy place it should be.
Okay, caring for our marine environment, trying to reverse some of the huge damage that's been done to it. Wow, okay, well we've got, by my count, 7 really great questions there. Reconnecting people to nature, brackets, building places, not just homes. 2% on walking and cycling. It's not enough as any party planning to improve it, given the obvious carbon emissions and health benefits of having a more evenly distributed transport culture, sustainable growth and the planning system. Are there any plans to change the planning system, as it were? And it's noted that the Green Party at least has introduced the idea of an equal right of appeal into the planning system, which is not there at the moment. The marine question that we just had, education on the environment, how can that be stopped from just being an add-on and be mainstreamed into our education? Something like, changing our building culture so that we don't have it's house building culture, and finally the food policy question, which was very clearly directed towards Heather. Heather, do you want to answer that question about food policy, and particularly the question about how do food activists like you make governments like the SNP government, to which you are obviously a supporter, actually implement some of these more radical ideas?
We put up resolutions and get them passed. So there's a huge amount of interest in the party around a citizens' agricultural policy. They agreed to pass a resolution on the right to food. There was a lot of debate about food banks. At one point there was a motion suggesting that we allow supermarkets to recycle food waste, and that was rejected on the grounds that there should be a more dignified response where people are food citizens, not recipients of charity. So the right to food is in there as a strong idea. The right to we're looking at ways of relocalising the food system. So there's acknowledgement that there's been a huge emphasis on exports, the balance of payments, Scotland's larder, and what there is now is a real hunger for changing the domestic food policy and making sure that we work with farmers to get food to people of all income levels. So that whole thing about restructuring the distribution system, finding new ways of helping farmers not just have to supply the 6 supermarkets, but begin to grow food that they can supply to communities is completely on the agenda. It's an area that we want to develop. I also wanted to say something about sustainability, and the Curriculum for Excellence means that every child in Scotland has a right to an education in sustainability. So focusing on getting children and their families out to farms, developing agritourism as a way of engaging people on the land. And personally on our farm we ran a course called Growing Global Food Citizens for Teachers, where we spent 5 days with teachers talking about soil sustainability, the history of food, how food affects your body, how food affects the planet. So I think there are ways of making sure that schools become more creative and engaged and confident about this agenda, so that it's not just a moralistic agenda, it's actually completely practical, because you could use food to teach anything, from physics to biology to history. Food is an engine for everything to change.
Yeah, you can and you should. I'm not particularly directing this at you, Heather, though, but I feel as if there's often an awful lot of motherhood and apple pie when people talk about food. I mean, if you look at our food culture now, it's entirely driven by companies who, I mean, huge food companies who between them have effectively destroyed the cooking culture. I mean, while everybody sits and watches baking programmes on the telly, people increasingly are not eating anything but pre-prepared food of various kinds, and very little hands-on cooking is going on, except occasionally on a special occasion at weekends or something, and people have these big flashy kitchens that they never use. And it seems to me that we're not really addressing root and branch the problem of our food culture. And indeed, if we did address it root and branch and destroyed this industry, look at the jobs and the retail activity that would disappear with it. So if we're talking about transitioning away from a poor food culture, which we currently have, then we're talking about something almost as profound as the carbon transition, actually, and very closely bound up with the carbon transition. So it's not something that you can just easily make effective policy about. There's lots of things you can do at the margins, but really changing the structure, it would be the work of a generation and more, I think, and would threaten an awful lot of economic activity to do with the processing of food, which goes into growth figures in a way that people cooking at home and doing something healthy actually does not. And that's a question about how we measure growth and economic activity in our societies, which is far too complicated to address, unfortunately, because we've got all these other questions to answer. Right, I'm just going to go round the rest of the panel and ask them to pick a couple of these questions that they particularly want to talk about. Sarah.
I'd like to pick up the food issue and say that we've passed a Procurement Act in the Parliament, and that we know on the one hand we've got a very big public sector procurement process that we could be influencing more effectively, shorter food chains, we've got very high standards of animal welfare in Scotland, and we could use that public sector process and more local markets to try and reduce those food chain links and actually help. I mean, I think of it as I'm totally signed up to fair trade when it's countries abroad and it's vulnerable communities, and there is an issue about smaller farmers, organic farmers that need more active support in Scotland, and in terms of legislation we can do that, but a lot of the pressure in local government in particular, or key parts of the public sector, is about pushing the price down. So it's not about inflating prices, it's about fairer prices, and I think there's a real agenda that across the parties we need to push on. But Food Procurement Act, shorter food chains and food markets has got to be part of that. In terms of what's happening in school, I went to a series of secondary schools to talk about climate change before the Paris talks, and basically had to totally rewrite my speech after the first class when I realised they knew a huge amount about climate change. They'd clearly be studying it, and they were enthusiastic, and there were all sorts of really difficult questions coming my direction. I don't think we've got the same in terms of environmental policy generally in our schools, and I think there's a disconnect. I think there's a lot in primary schools and the eco-schools movement. I don't see that feeding through to the secondary school movement, so I think there's some opportunities to pick up there. And maybe my last point, I'm going to roll together Maggie's point, Claire's point, a gentleman's point about house builders. The people that take the longest term view on house building and community development tend to be housing associations, local authorities and housing co-ops, because there's a degree of accountability. They can think for the next 25 years in terms of who's going to be in those houses. A private house builder is thinking about making the money off the land, making the money off the building and getting off that site as soon as possible. So we need to think about how we use the planning system, and I like the Warm Homes Act could start intervening in that process, thinking about what is legitimate to ask in terms of building and energy structures at the local level. And it's not manicured grass we need, it's things like orchards, it's things like community gardens, where you see it, particularly in the city centre, where you see the Back Greens initiative, people's lives are transformed by being able to talk to their neighbours, grow food, have a garden that's suddenly useful. So a lot of this stuff is very small, and I think because it's very small, it doesn't rise up the political agenda fast enough. So it's probably like the energy infrastructure project. It needs a big badge so that everybody thinks it's a big thing, like allotments in every community, and then it's easier to build the support for it. But that would be, from the Scottish Labour perspective, making our communities more sustainable for people and fairer for people. Because if you've got the money, you can buy some of this. If you don't have the money, you don't have a choice. And there's a real issue about improving the quality of all of our urban spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Miles?
I'll touch on a few points which Sarah mentioned there. I think actually, when we're looking at community use of land, just before I came here today, I spoke to a friend who has an allotment in Portobello, and she was celebrating because the council had just rejected a planning application for that piece of land. But she said it's not over because we've been told they're able to appeal, and it will probably get through next time. That was her statement to me. And you start to worry, well, at what point is localism, at what point is our councils actually taking these decisions for their communities and actually the developers listening to that? So I think it's something we have to look at, because there's a lot of developments, including some wind farm developments, where the communities have faced them time and time again, and they feel that the planning system is closing in on them. So I think it's an area we have to look at. In terms of education and outdoor education specifically, I'm passionate about this, and the Conservatives, I think, were the only party in the last Parliament to try to bring forward a policy where every state pupil would have a week of outdoor education during their time at school. That was almost halfway there. My boss at the time, Liz Smith, had done a lot of work on this. £1 million was actually allocated under a budget under the minority government, but we've never seen it implemented as a policy. It's just one step towards actually reconnecting people with our environment, with our land, and I think it's something I hope we can bring back in the next Parliament. In terms of food, I just wanted to touch on it quickly. I think how we actually know where our food comes from is actually a key point, because in the last Parliament we had a buy local, eat local campaign which the Conservative Party ran, and it tied in nicely with the whole food miles issues, because I don't think people often, when they do go round the supermarket, do know where their foods come from. They just buy on bulk a lot of the time, and it's actually reconnecting, I keep saying that word, a lot of it's about getting people to understand where things are coming from, how we have a sustainable environmental policy across the board, from how we design our houses to actually where our food's coming from. So I hope we can see a lot of progress in this area.
Thank you very much. I've lost track of where I'm at. Mark's turn there, I think. Mark, do you want to pick up on some of these questions?
Yeah, I think the whole questions around planning and housing and the aspirations that communities have around, green space and community growing and everything else, comes back to the fact that we need to have a plan-led system in Scotland, in our communities, that's actually respected by developers. And, for the last 4 years as a councillor, I've spent, a lot of my time fighting with communities against A.L. King or Judy Murray or Graham's Dairies to try and prevent development on the Greenbelt. And, none of these proposed developments have actually been in our local development plan. Now, what I see is, communities up and down the length of Scotland putting in a lot of time into contributing into local development plans. Many hundreds of hours, many people contributing, and actually, seeing the local development plan as a way to deliver your aspirations for sustainable housing, mixed in with green space, mixed in with retail and everything else. And then for developers to come along who've effectively been banking Greenbelt land, to come along and just to say, well, actually, we're just going to, ignore your local development plan and put through an application anyway, I think is incredibly wearing for communities. And the specific policy we've put into the Green Party manifesto isn't actually a blanket third-party right of appeal for communities. It's actually an appeal on the basis that if a local decision goes against the local development plan, against the democratic agreed plan, then the community gets the right of appeal. Unfortunately, we have got kind of policies that keep coming out from the Scottish Government which almost sort of seem to kind of centralise a lot of this decision making. So there was a policy that came out, Scottish planning policy last year, which required councils to allocate an additional 10% of housing land on top of the land which they've already allocated. Now in Stirling, we just completed our local development plan. So then it's like, oh, hang on a minute, we've got to find an extra 10% of land. So developers then pile in and say, oh, we've got Greenbelt sites that we've been land banking for 20 years. We could bring this forward. So there is something here about local democracy and about getting the democratic process behind the agreed local development plan and making that the best plan that we can. Just briefly pick up on the marine point, because obviously our populations of marine wildlife are impacted not just by overfishing but on climate change as well. So we need to complete, I think, that network of marine protected areas, and we need to recognise that overfishing, particularly of the species which support the other species up the food chain, could impact on those key species such as orcas. I think in terms of food as well, I mean, this is such a huge agenda, and it's a cultural agenda, it's an economic agenda, and I think it does come back again to localism. We need to create local food economies. I go into food's not being produced in a cook-chill facility on the edge of an industrial estate. It's actually being produced in school. Kids are getting involved in deciding what the menus are. They're getting involved in food marketing. They're understanding where food's being produced. And increasing numbers of schools are actually, managing their own hens or growing on the school estate as well. And for me, it joins up. And that is kind of one example of how we need to recreate a local food economy that involves the community, involves the public sector, because the public sector pound is extremely important in driving this, and link it in with the land reform agenda to make sure that there are opportunities for community-supported agriculture or growth within our areas. But the Greenbelt, housing and food, is absolutely important. At the moment, the Greenbelt's almost hemming in communities, and it's being controlled by speculative housing developers. We need to see a land reform agenda that can break that green belt out, encourage access, encourage wider access to the environment, and also look at how we can, have sustainable ways to develop that, whether it's for biodiversity or food production or whatever.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. And I noticed that the one question, and it's interesting that it should come to Martin as our final speaker here on these questions, because the one question that hasn't been answered is the simplest and most succinct one, which is, why has there only ever been 2% support for walking or cycling in any Scottish Government budget ever? Not enough influence from Liberal Democrats, Martin will probably
Absolutely, yeah, but I'm glad that I got the email on the topic and I was able to respond positively. We need absolutely to set up not just to strengthen the national network, but do whatever we can locally. Now, you can be restricted in a city, but parts where Leaf Walk are, for example, that is one of the top 10 most dangerous cycling streets in the UK. we need to have proper cycle lanes, or closer to my doorstep even, on Lower Granton Road, where again, and there is still the land available there to produce a proper cycle lane, but it's just not being used. You know, it's this kind of small scale, just joined out, obvious thinking that just needs to happen. And I look towards, I've worked in Germany, in Netherlands, Denmark, and I know what is potentially possible there, and that links into the planning as well for the density of housing. I think we better have a look at how many people we're willing to cram in to a certain area, because in the UK in whole we do have minimum standards here in Scotland. In England they don't, and it's kind of crazy. If we want to have good communities, then it has to be as part of how many people are we willing to cram in, and what kind of facilities are they going to get? There's no real school, not school playground, there's no playgrounds for local children in my area where I live on New Haven Harbour, and it's a new development, you know. So where is the legislation? We want to strengthen the legislation, not just for the inside of the house, but for the whole environment as well, and make sure that services like schools and doctors are also part of that, and that's also for existing communities like in Moorhouse in West Pilton, where there is just a lack of those basic services, especially in doctors. I've been listening. There's one gentleman there who's doubting it. So that's what the communities there are saying to me. So
that's great. That is about building not just houses but places.
Absolutely,
yep.
Absolutely.
Okay.
On the marine side, we really, it's almost as big as the food, because I'm probably one of the few people in this room, I'm not saying the only people, who's got a Siemens ticket and has actually been out to see areas. And if you go to the Northwest Pacific, or you go to the Black Sea, for example, which is fairly enclosed, then you see the plastic there, and it's going to take a global effort in order to clear this up, and international cooperation. So yes, let's do what we can. And we've got the 30 marine protected areas at the moment in Scotland. We want to see that strengthened, brought up even to national park status, maybe onshore, offshore national parks, involving local communities there. I was not aware that the orca situation was so bad. We can talk about that later, but yeah, I would like to know more on that one.
Can we wind up?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, just to wind up on the, I'll finish on the education, because it seems to be pretty good up to primary level, but we've seen substantive cuts over the last two parliaments to our education. That's why a key policy of the Lib Dems is to have that 1 penny in the pound income tax rise, purely for education, and reinvest again in all walks of life, from nursery right through to lifelong education. And I would like to see the environmental agenda very much key to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, is there anyone on the panel who absolutely feels that they haven't had their say on any question that they think they should have had their say on? No? No, you're all exhausted, you're all talked out. Wonderful.
We're responding to your tone of voice.
Well, I realise we started about 5 minutes late, so I don't mind finishing 5 minutes late, but I don't want to keep this very patient and very brilliant audience who have asked some wonderful questions. I don't want to keep them any later than the stated time. Really. I forgot to tell you at the beginning that you're supposed to be tweeting on Enviro Matters 2016. So if you want to tweet hashtag Enviro Matters 2016, please do, and say what a wonderful session we've had with our 5 panellists here. My own feeling is that what's impressive is really 2 things, or at least what's impressive is one thing, and what's absent, I think, is 2 things. What's impressive is the amount of common ground. It's quite clear that if you're looking out to 2040 or 2050, then most sensible thinking human beings on the planet, including most party politicians, despite the bad rep that they get, can see roughly where we need to be in terms of having a carbon transition, in terms of changing our food culture, in terms of changing the way we think about energy provision, about travel, about the way we build homes and other buildings, etc. What we don't have, though, is even the beginnings of a common strategy for getting there. We've got some small elements of it in place, and you can see that in the United Nations process. But across the party political divides, there's really very little absolute outright agreement on yes, we will all gather around this strategy and none of us will oppose it because we see that it's absolutely essential. So we need some kind of intermediary thing going on there where some elements of party politics are simply sacrificed, if you like, to the kind of higher purpose of actually dealing with these absolutely vital generational problems, and that we have some kind of working consensus around them so that every government that's elected, regardless of differences on other matters, can get on with this absolutely vital agenda for protecting and saving the environment on which we all depend. And I think the other great lack, maybe, is just what I was trying to hint at in the food debate there, is realism about the short-term, the strength of the short-term obstacles to some of these changes. I mean, those obstacles will crumble eventually because it will become obvious that the changes are imperative. But already many would argue that those short-term obstacles have left a lot of this process until it's almost too late. And by that I mean traditional energy interests, traditional food industry interests. And these things are not, I mean, they may be enemies of a certain kind of political process, but they're not enemies of the people, if you like. These are huge industries which keep our homes powered, which provide us with the food supplies that we have at the moment, and which, of course, employ, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people worldwide. So, you know, making those industries transition and getting rid of the inertias that those industries create in the process of change is a really vital and very complicated political process, and it requires both a lot of dialogue and a kind of understanding, an almost Zen understanding of when the moment arrives when you really need to confront a vested interest that is trying to defend something that is no longer defensible. And all of that, I think, is a task for all politicians who all, despite wherever they come from on the political perspective, bring a certain capacity to that. And above all, of course, delighted to hear so much consensus tonight about the importance of the local and of what can be done at community level to change people's lives, to suggest new ways forward, and to empower people in ways that really makes it possible for them to become part of the change we all want to see. There seems to be a lot of consensus on that, and let's hope in this coming Scottish Parliament we can see some legislation coming forward that really takes big steps in making that a reality. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to our wonderful panel, who I think have given us a great discussion tonight. Thank you to all of you who asked questions. Thank you to the University of Edinburgh for being our wonderful hosts here at Murray House. And thank you to Independence Live and Gavin over there for live streaming this event to whoever out there in the waiting world wants to know what was said. Thank you very much, and safe home. This is great. Thank you.